For this Sunday's shipwreck video, we'll continue with the high seas fleet. Last weekend, we looked at SMS Derflinger. This time, the ship will be SMS Seydlitz. This is a ship best known for the absolute beating she took at Jutland. So much damage, in fact, that the ship very nearly sank on the way home. Yet she survived and returned to service. Seydlitz would see out the Great War before ending up with the rest of the high seas fleet at Scapa Flow, where she would be scuttled, ending up in one of the more unique orientations of that group. Something that would, as it turned out, make her salvage into a bit of a headache. Before that, a short summary on how she ended up in that position. Much like the rest of the high seas fleet, SMS Seydlitz was interned in Scapa Flow. With the end of the Great War, the German fleet needed to be sorted out. Initially, this saw the ships interned under close British watch. This would last from November 1918 until June 1919. During this process, Admiral Ludwig von Reuter had to make a decision. Sources will differ on exactly what happened at this point. Some will say he acted on his own. Others will say he was following orders, either official or unofficial. Regardless, Reuter decided to scuttle the fleet on June 21st of 1919. Their British guards had mostly left on training, leaving an opening that the Germans exploited. By that night, most of their fleet was on the bottom. The only capital ship to avoid that fate was SMS Baden, due to quick British reaction. Seydlitz, meanwhile, joined the rest of the fleet. However, this ship had been moored in relatively shallow water, not deep enough to capsize, but also too deep to sink upright. Instead, the Große rolled over to her starboard side and came to a halt 70 feet or 21 meters down. The issue here was the ship's beam. This came out to 93 feet or 28.5 meters, meaning a good 20 feet remained above the surface. You can see that quite clearly here, the number 3 turret partially above the water, along with the portside casements. Seydlitz was in an incredibly awkward position when it came to salvage. If it were a matter of cutting into the wreck as she lay in place, well, that was one thing. Actually raising the wreck was another entirely. Raising a ship sideways, that would require entirely new engineering solutions to patch holes and distribute weight. A ship is not designed to float on her side. Because of this, Seydlitz was left in place at first, at least for the most part. As Ernst Cox said about salvaging the Scapa Flow wrecks, he looked at Seydlitz in 1926. Not for salvage, at least not yet. Instead, he was looking at a source of resources. During that year, British coal miners went on strike. Cox, as you could expect, needed coal for his operations. So he turned to Seydlitz. The ship's portside coal bunkers were above the waterline. So Cox had his workers cut into the hull, where they found full bunkers of dry coal. As a result, German coal would fuel the efforts to raise German ships, at least until British coal was flowing again. This was it for work on Seydlitz, at least officially. Cox wouldn't return to the wreck until June 1927. He was set on raising the ship, despite the massive challenges this entailed. No one had ever brought a ship up sideways quite like this. Nonetheless, Cox was a determined kind of man, so his workers set to their jobs. The first thing they did was remove all the armor on the port side. This was done for 2 reasons. First, to sell off the high-quality steel for further funding, and second, to lighten the ship. This would, in theory, make the starboard armor belt act like a second keel. In practice, this is up for debate. It also wouldn't work out that way anyway, as we'll see later on. In any event, Cox's men removed the armor and sealed all the gaps in the hull, including where the ship's funnels had once been located. This work lasted into June 1928, including through a particularly stormy season, where 4 men were actually stranded for a day aboard the wreck. Fortunately, that was the worst it got for the workers. They managed to finish their work by June without any major accidents. As a result, Cox could attempt to bring Seydlitz up on June 12, 1928, when the weather was actually calm. Almost exactly 9 years after she first went down, the battlecruiser began to come out of the water. At first, it looked like it would work. Seydlitz came up, slowly but surely. It seemed that Cox would enter the record books, the first man to raise a ship sideways. And then Seydlitz decided to fight back. 2 of the ship's bulkheads had collapsed under the strain of her awkward orientation. This threw off the fine balance necessary to keep her afloat, and the ship's bow shot up out of the water before rolling over again. This time the ship was almost completely capsized. The only thing keeping her from completely rolling over were the turrets and superstructure. It was a failure similar, if not a bit worse, to what happened in the early attempts to raise SMS Hindenburg. On the upside, such as it was, Seydlitz was now in an easier position to raise. Cox knew how to bring up a capsized ship after raising SMS Moltke. Moreover, most of the big patches remained in place, so that was some of the work already done. The salvage crew just needed to straighten the wreck and work her out of the bottom. This work was done by October 1928, and a second attempt could be made to bring Seydlitz up. However, the second attempt went little better than the first. Seydlitz came up, and then began to roll over in the opposite direction. Understandably, Cox was baffled by this, and spent the rest of October raising the ship to try and figure out the issue. Each time, Seydlitz would roll and refuse to settle. Cox's Navy quotes the man here. 20 times she was nearly right, and 20 times we had to begin all over again. You can look at it as the ship fighting back, I suppose. From an engineering perspective, the issue was simpler. As Seydlitz came up, she was at the borderline of positive and negative buoyancy. Even a slight list at the wrong time could send all the water to the other side, hence the tendency to roll over after the ship surfaced. Eventually, Cox would cut up scrap boilers and fill them with concrete. These were then fitted to massive steel cables to support the wreck as it came up. With all this work in place, a final attempt was made on November 2nd, 1928. Seydlitz slowly came up once more. Things seemed to be going well when the ship fought back one last time. As Cox began to relax, Seydlitz suddenly dipped by the bow. One of the cables broke, and then the rest followed. It looked like another failure, except this time, Seydlitz remained afloat. After years of work and months of failure, the wreck finally floated. Upside down, yes, but she was off the bottom. Before I move on, there is an interesting note here. There's a story that Seydlitz came up by accident when Cox was on vacation. As the story goes, he wanted cameras present to see him when the ship came up. So Cox ordered Seydlitz sunk again before he returned for the November 2nd lift. I'm leery about how true this story is. Cox's Navy is generally reliable, and it notes that he spent most of October trying to raise the ship, not vacationing in Switzerland. So make of that what you will. In any case, with Seydlitz afloat, the ship could be prepared for scrapping. This involved removing excess steel and fitting counterweights in place of the missing port armor. This work would finish in May 1929, with Seydlitz towed off on May 29th, directly into a massive storm. This would nearly sink the ship, if not for heroic efforts by Thomas Mackenzie and the salvage crew aboard the wreck. For 6 days they fought the weather, fixing damage to the pumps and keeping out as much water as they could. More than once it looked like Seydlitz might sink. In the end, however, the wreck made it to safer waters, and in June 1929 she was handed off to the scrappers. It must be said that the crews of the German tugboats also put in hard work to keep their tow lines intact. Still, with all of that covered, let's briefly look at some of the wreck pictures, specifically those of her voyage to scrapping and the final image of the ship. We've already seen some of the pictures of her salvage, and there's not much to note there. Simply the overturned hulk with the long trunks fitted to act as airlocks. So we'll start by roping back to this picture. Here we have Seydlitz overturned and under tow. This picture is important for one major reason, and that's a direct comparison to Moltke in a similar position. There are 3 details you can use to tell the wrecks apart if you're looking at pictures of them. Let's look at Moltke to see those differences. On the older ship, the bow was cut open. You can see that here. She also had all 4 of her props, or screws, removed. The third detail, meanwhile, comes in the buildings. The main building is on the center line, with a smaller one offset to the side. We also have a nice picture inside those buildings, showing the pumping equipment it contained. Now for Seydlitz. Her bow is completely intact, and you can see one of her props here. As for the buildings, those are both on the side, with the smaller one directly behind the larger one. Those details are the easiest way to tell the wrecks apart, and how we know the following pictures are of Seydlitz and not Moltke. Take this for example. Here we can see the buildings, which are clearly on the side and in line with each other. As a result, this is a picture of Seydlitz, or at least most likely a picture of that wreck. If so, this was one of the calmer periods. We can see all the equipment on deck with no sign of rough weather, although the next picture does show some waves by the bow. It's here, however, where things get rougher. Water is beginning to rush aboard the ship, although this is before the equipment was knocked around. We don't seem to have any pictures of that damage, though that isn't surprising. Mackenzie and his men were rather busy at the time. Instead, we have a set of pictures showing water rushing over the wreck, such as this one, for example, or this one where the weather was getting worse. The ship is falling down into the waves, and you can see the water kicking up as well. But I think the most distinctive is this one, with very clearly rough water. I've got to give some credit to whoever took this picture, if only for their steady hand. Regardless, Seydlitz would make it to port. We can see that here from the deck, the ship being towed to scrapping after surviving the storm. There's also this view from the stern, where you can see the buildings and the prop, once more confirming this as Seydlitz. And then there's this one of the ship coming into dock, where we can see the intact bow, confirming it isn't Moltke. That's harder to say on the next one, although the buildings do look like Seydlitz. And that brings us to the final picture of the wreck here, overturned in dock, much like Derflinger was. This is a good stern shot, showing the rusting of the hull and that bent prop. But not much beyond that, so we'll end things here, at least with the main wreck. Seydlitz actually left some debris behind, so we'll look at that to finish the video. Here's a piece of a funnel, and here's one of her 88mm guns. Not as impressive as the turrets left behind by Bayern, but still the last surviving pieces of SMS Seydlitz. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.